All right. Hey Zane, how you doing?
Good, man. How you doing?
I'm doing good. We're laughing because this is now the third time we have done this recording. So let's do it again. Uh, this is Zane, one of my best friends. I'm the godfather to his daughter, and I'm about to move up there to Kentucky. I'm down here in Texas, but that's how we know each other. But I've been very interested in the problem of misinformation and disinformation. The spread of this has been, of both of them, has been unbelievable in our country. In fact, it has led to the confusion of millions of people who think they are right, who have trouble finding good information and knowing where to go. And my main argument for this is always critical thinking. I think that critical thinking is the best antidote we have to this problem, to the plethora and the widespread of just bad information. Now, the reason I'm talking to you is because you are currently getting a PhD over this very subject, over the subject of you getting a PhD specifically in communications. But do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Absolutely. I'm glad I can talk about it because my fiance gets tired of me always talking about communication.
Your
So
daughter
I'm
will
I'm glad
listen,
to
though.
be on here, man. But yeah, no. So I'm in the last couple of years here of my PhD. I'm going into my third year, and so at University of Kentucky. So what I study is, get my PhD in communication, but I study more persuasion and particularly source characteristics. So, who do we believe? Why do we believe them? But what particular factors go into why do we believe somebody? So that has led me to misinformation. Why do we believe misinformation from one source but not another? And other areas like language and stuff. So, persuasion, source characteristics. Who do we believe? Why do we believe them?
I mean, you're even published in a Harvard journal for this very subject, right?
Yes. During the pandemic, when we were all locked in our houses, I had a lot of extra time on my hands. And so we did a study about misinformation on, I believe it was Twitter, on a bunch of tweets. And we found different variables that go into whether or not something's characterized as misinformation and what factors influence whether or not someone's persuaded or not. So, yeah, they got published in a Harvard journal, so that was pretty cool.
So you're
Like I said,
definitely you're
yeah,
definitely the guy to talk to, and I'm lucky enough to be your long, I guess, childhood friend. So it's kind of
yeah,
works out perfectly.
I'm glad to be on here. Like I said, people like to talk about themselves sometimes, and my fiance gets tired of me always talking about communication. So,
Well, good. Now you get a reason to. So let's just dive in. I think that maybe we should go over from your experience and from what you've studied. Why is it that people? Why? Well, first off, why does misinformation and disinformation spread at all in the first place?
so yeah, I mean, we kind of talked about this too before. Is um, to start, you got to kind of separate the difference between misinformation and disinformation. So, misinformation is the key difference is intent. So, misinformation is going to be without intent. Disinformation is with intent.
Hmm.
Some people spread false information knowing that it's not true, where disinformation is people spread information or false information, but they don't know that it's not true. So I think a good example that I thought of within the last few minutes was just think of grade school, right? Someone spreads a rumor, they know it's not true, but then it gets passed to a bunch of people, and those people start spreading that. They don't know that it's not true, but they're spreading that misinformation throughout all the other third graders,
Right.
right? The first person knew it wasn't true. They're just starting to stir up a bunch of gossip. That's disinformation, but the other people are spreading it, not knowing that it's not true or whatnot. And so that's more so of misinformation. But that happens on a much more drastic level with social media and other things like that, because a lot of times it's hard to discern who's an accurate source of information and who's not.
Right.
Um, so having that separation is difficult, but having to know, first off, what processes people focus on when trying to critically evaluate information is a whole another step. So when we evaluate messages or information, just think about all the information that you encounter in one whole day. That's a lot of information. We can't critically analyze every piece, but the ones that we do critically analyze, we typically, one, we have a higher ability to process it, and two, we have a higher motivation. So motivation, you can look at it, is the issue actually relevant to you? And if it is, you're more likely to critically evaluate the message. But also one's ability. Do you have a lot of knowledge about the particular topic, and are you less biased?
Hmm.
So and if you have more bias, if you don't have a lot of knowledge, and let's say the issue is not as relevant, you're more likely to not critically evaluate it and rely on other cues, right?
Such
So
as.
there's a lot of different cues, and in communication, we refer to them as heuristics. And so
Hmm.
heuristics are more so of these mental shortcuts that we use to make decisions. And
Right.
so just think about you're at a store and it says last day 30% off. Now, you might not need that pair of pants. If you have 8 pairs of pants at home, the issue might not be as relevant to you. You might not be as biased, but to be on, and you don't have as much knowledge about, as far as, well, really, is it the last day? You don't feel like having to calculate all that stuff out, but you say, and that's what we call scarcity heuristic. It's that whole fear of missing out. If I don't do it today, well, you know what? Screw it. I'm just going to buy it. And same thing with authority heuristic. A lot of times we don't question what our doctor says because they're a doctor. We don't go home and actually research the antibiotic that they gave us for our sickness. We just say, well, they have a lab coat on. They know what they're talking about. So, yeah.
Okay, that's okay. So I can see how it can go really deep into like the reasons and the motivations people basically believe things. And it's interesting that whenever you talk about heuristics, I'm always reminded of logical fallacies because they're very similar. Like you just brought up the argument of authority, but in philosophy, it's a little different. It's a false authority. So a doctor would be an authority figure, but or ad populum, like bandwagoning, or I don't know. You said the scarcity heuristic. I don't know if there's a fallacy about that. I just got to do it because I get it done. Anyway, but it always reminds me of that. Basically, a lapse in judgment is what a fallacy is. A fallacy is a bad reasoning skills. It's an argument that is not good for reasoning. It's just a false. And so it's funny that a lot of the reasons people get on board with misinformation and disinformation is just simply bad reasoning, and people are unaware that this is bad reasoning. So I guess to me, it's interesting, like what to do about that. But the other question I have for you is like, what do you think that there's more of you were saying earlier that misinformation is just this unintentional spread of information, but then of just the bad information. But then you said disinformation is an intentional spreading, kind of like gossip, like in third grade, is an intentional spreading of bad information. In your experience, do you know which one happens more? Like, is there more of a deliberate spread of bad information, or is there more of a mistaken spread of bad information?
I would say personally misinformation, but that's just because of a lot of times we don't have the knowledge. If you're even talking about, like, just think of COVID-19, right? Um, the amount of misinformation was rampant. Holding your breath for 10 seconds, gargling salt water or bleach. The fact that people were really actually considering things like that is absurd. But the thing is that a lot of that was unintentional. People weren't a lot of times thinking that, oh, I know this is fake, I'm going to send it to people. But a lot of times we have to consider the context and what people are actually paying attention to and what's making them believe that. And that's really where I come in as a social scientist is, okay, well, why are people actually spreading this and why are people believing it? And so that key part of intent. Because, for example, if you're going on social media where a lot of this is present, um, you'll see things where a lot of research has focused on. You mentioned that the bandwagon, right? That's a whole nother heuristic that we look at. It's just simply called the bandwagon heuristic. But if somebody has, let's say, more followers, let's say you
Hmm.
have 10,000 followers versus just five, and you post something that's like, hey, did you know that X treatment will cure this? You might be like, hey, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to retweet that. But you might not know if it's true or not. But what you're doing is you're relying on this person because they have so many followers. And so that's especially what happens, especially on social media. It's so easy to just share something or spread something without intentionally, knowing that it's fake. And so online settings has made that unintentional spread much more significant.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I would see it too, is that it's an unintentional spread. The deliberate spread seems to be more political, kind of like what we found with like Russia, not to make it overly political, but Russia has been known for doing this to other countries for years. Specific, even before the Ukrainian war, they gave them unbelievable amounts of misinformation. A lot of the misinformation that comes from, well, I guess you would call it disinformation at that point. And a lot of the disinformation in our country is also can be attributed to for Russia. Um, and and it's unfortunate that that's the case. I wonder though, what do you think is the road out? So you're getting a PhD in this, and you're studying all the reasons why people are, you know, basically spreading misinformation, disinformation, believing misinformation. What do you think the road to recovery is? Now, that's kind of a loaded, it's a big question. So I
Yeah.
thought maybe we could move into that a little bit.
The road to recovery, coffee, alcohol, getting a tenure track position, studying this for 50 to 60 years, and then retiring. No, no. Honestly, it's tricky, right? Uh, Instead of trying to tackle on, how do we cure this spread of misinformation, it's focusing on what factors do people pay attention to, and then tackle that. Because if people know what factors are most influential, they'll know how to or what to look for,
Right.
right? Um, if people know that, like for example, that study that we did that got published in the Harvard Journal, um, the tweets that contain the most misinformation used non-specific authority cues.
Hmm.
So they would see things like, or the tweets would say things like, my friend's dad, who's a doctor, or these doctors in Japan said. So they're very non-specific, where tweets that had corrective information, so if they were trying to debunk misinformation, would be very specific. This doctor at the CDC, insert name,
Ooh, that's
or here's
interesting.
a link. So if you actually show people how to attack it or debunk it, so the whole point is trying to show them the techniques and the tactics. But to also, oh no, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that's very interesting that, so you're saying that like people, so that it's very clear when information that comes at us, usually it's more vague. Like where it comes from is just vagary. Like, oh, doctors say this and scientists say this. And it's really vague. Rather than the more specific it becomes, probably more likely it's more accurate, that information.
Because it's more verifiable if
Right.
it's specific,
Yeah, it's hard to
and
verify
if it's
information when it's just like vague, and
yes.
you can look at it, and so I'm curious about that. Well, then why do people not? I guess the question is, why are people so ready to believe? That's probably the good answer.
Um,
Why are people ready to believe?
so a lot of this boils down to, uh, I don't know, we had talked about this too, previously, but a lot of this too is based on one's group membership. So significantly. So um, the groups that we belong to, of course, are going to shape who we are, right? And of course, we saw this with COVID-19. If you belong to the Democratic Party, you're going to believe what the Democrats say. If you're a Republican Party, you're going to believe what the Republicans say, no matter what, blindly. But we see this other times with religious affiliations. If you're a Christian, if a Christian says so, I will do that. It's, and that's a heuristic cue, or in, philosophy, you characterize it more as a fallacy, which a heuristic, like I said, it's a mental shortcut. So what you're doing is you're not critically evaluating it. So
Right.
it could be characterized as a fallacy. But what you're doing, right, is as human beings, we always want to look good. We want to have our best us, our positive identity. And so no matter what, if our group, doesn't matter what political party you are, let's say Democrats or Republicans, if they say something and you are even hesitant whether or not it's true or false, you're still going to say, yeah, they're right.
Right.
Because if your group looks good, guess who else looks good? You do.
Right.
Yep. You're not going to admit that the other group is right because your group looks bad. And if you belong to that group, then you look bad. So what you're going to do is you're going to say, your group's wrong, my group's right, therefore I look good.
Hence why people vote down party lines. Like they
Hmm.
vote based on
Exactly.
even if they disagree with them on a particular issue, they'll still vote for them because they're on my team. This
Hmm.
inside out group
Exactly.
mentality. Yeah.
Yep, it's the same thing. It's another heuristic, right? It's based on my group, my group's right, and there's another term that we can use to describe it. It's something called in-group bias, and so in-group bias is when you compare your group to another group, you only highlight your group's positives and you only highlight the other group's negatives. So what you're doing is you're omitting that your group has any negatives and you're not even acknowledging that the other group has positives. We do it in sports all the time too. If your team has a 1 in 15 season, you win one game and lose 15, but the other team wins 16 and they lose 0, some way you will make your team look great. You won't acknowledge that you lost 15, you won't acknowledge that the other team won 16, but you'll say, oh, remember you threw 3 interceptions, and you'll just make your team look better, then worse because it makes you look good. Same thing. And so, kind of go back to your point a little bit. Because our group says so, we belong to that group, we're going to believe it, even if we're hesitant.
Yeah,
But we do so, yeah,
yeah, I mean that's really
because of
it's
that
really
reason.
interesting because it seems to be a the symptom of misinformation and disinformation is really a much more deeper rooted issue or psychology that human beings have evolved to have. Uh, sorry for everyone who doesn't believe in evolution. But yes, we've evolved to have these kind of in-group, out-group mentalities, and it's destroying us in a lot of ways. Like you were saying with being like the in-group mentality. What did you call it? The in-group heuristic?
I mean, you could definitely call it a heuristic. I'm sure there's a much better name for it,
Well,
but
it's a It's just
that's
we call it a
essentially,
bandwagoning fallacy. So you know
yeah. Well,
you're part of your group, and
mhm.
what you're describing as like you're only going to describe the good things about what your group does, the arguments that your group has, the good, and then only cast the other group as bad. And of course, we call that a straw man. You know, we set up a straw kind of person, so it's easily knocked down. And so when we project, let's say Democrats or Republicans, like you can project a Democrat as fluffy snowflakes, as they say, and then you can project Republicans as racist bigots. Both of those are straw men, right? Both of those are easily knocked down, and but that's interesting because to me it seems that there's a much deeper issue at the core of all of this, which is much more seated in our psychology, in our constant reliance on in-group and out-group thinking.
Oh, yeah, it's there's a theory that just kind of overarches a lot of this called social identity theory, which just pretty much outlines that we favor. our group members, and as a result we also derogate or just kind of not necessarily ostracize, but we just negatively characterize our group members,
Yeah.
and we do that because it makes us look better, right? Especially in highly polarized situations. Just imagine if someone came up to you and was like, hey, did you know, and during the height of COVID, let's say you're a Democrat, and somebody else that's a Democrat, and they're like, hey, did you know that consuming X amount of honey a day can reduce your chances of COVID? You'd be like, oh, great, I didn't know that.
Right.
You'd probably maybe believe it a little more. Now, let's say someone that's a Republican comes up to you and says, hey, did you know that consuming, you know, X amount of honey a day? And you'd be like, oh, I didn't know that, right? So that's a very, exaggerated example a bit, but it just kind of shows that, if that group membership is salient, if it's very important or very high up in, characterizing who you are, then you're more likely to be influenced by members of that group.
Yeah, and it seems though too that a large reason that that's such a problem, like when we hear information that from somebody we or is in our group, they're a Christian, they're a Democrat, whatever, then we're going to believe them. I think it also goes back to how we identify personally, like the way we think of our sense of self and our like you were said. I don't know if it was in the re-recording, but you were saying earlier, everybody wants to be a good human. Everybody has this persona they want to like upkeep, this kind of model that they have in their head, and we identify with our groups very deeply. So when our group is criticized or anything like that, we take it personally. We think it's a personal attack. So we actually literally feel the need to side even harder with our group or attack the other side just for sake of attacking. When rather we're not able to look at problems clearly because we're so wrapped up in this identity. This identity of our politics, our religion, our skin color, our gender, whatever it is, we're so wrapped up in it that we can't look at arguments as they are. But again, it seems to go back to this deep-seated psychological thing that human beings have. So kind of maybe to tie the loop off a little bit with what we began this with, which was, what is the road to recovery? Getting a like we can do a lot of research. Well, let me ask you this: what do you think what you're doing in research? How do you think that will help recovery? And what I mean by recovery, to be clear, is the losing of the spread of misinformation, or at least people not so easily being given into bad information or even wanting to spread deliberately misinformation. What do you think your research, how that can help support lessening that? That's a terribly worded question.
No. You're good. You're good. I'm trying to piecemeal it together. Um, so I think so. From that, you're asking more so of how to reduce people spreading misinformation.
How do we stop the problem? Like, how is it that your research is assisting with stopping the spread, the deliberate spread, and the undeliberate spread? That's not a word. Of information. Yeah.
I think so. What I'm really looking at is the processes by which people are persuaded and or believe misinformation. So, like, I'm interested in, just like somebody that's, in the field of marketing, they're interested in why a consumer buys a product, as opposed to we need to sell more. How do we sell more? And then a marketer will say, well, why are people doing it? You know what I mean? Same thing with what we're looking at. Instead of saying, all right, well, let's decrease the spread of misinformation, and we all sit in a circle and say, okay, well, how do we do
Right.
that?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
We need to focus on how and why people perceive something as misinformation and or why they are persuaded. So we'll look at things like I gave that example with the Harvard paper. One way is that when things are characterized as when misinformation is spreading, People use much more ambiguous sources, much more ambiguous terms. And then also, when people are trying to debunk misinformation, they use very specific sources, right? And so then we tell people, okay, when you're encountering misinformation or you're kind of confused, these are one tactic that people use when they're trying to be more authentic. And this is when people are trying to spread misinformation. But other things like, um, we've looked at things like that bandwagon queue, right? The number of likes, when sources typically have more likes versus just a few, people tend to perceive misinformation as more authentic because,
Yeah.
hey, a lot of people like this post. So then you tell people, hey, be wary of some post. Make sure to fact check information that has a lot of
I
likes.
guess what I was trying to say was, which I'm terrible at doing, is how is it that your research will be able to reach the broader public, those who matter? Those who matter are basically the common, what we can call lay people, because most people aren't academics. They're
Yeah,
kind of just so. How do they get access to this kind of information?
that's a $1 million question.
Right? Maybe that's the problem.
Well, it
You know.
is. It is. It's a huge problem, and that's just a problem in academia itself. Um, I mean, one is being able, because to get things published, you have to write like an academic, um, which is already cumbersome. It's like when you write a paper, it has words that you probably wouldn't even use in your
Right. You have to
day-to-day
be overly
conversations, or
technical.
you'll come off as condescending. Um, or since I do mostly quantitative and statistics, a lot of that has probability values, stats, models, things like that. And so the first sign of any math in an article, people are going to want to get sick and throw it away.
Right.
But I think the key part here is trying to find a healthy medium to have that, to convey from, and this is a problem in many fields, is to convey, how do we get our message, which I know this is the question you ask and I'm answering your question with a question, but how do we get that message to
That's
the public?
yeah.
You can, whether that be news outlets, things like this, right? Podcasts,
Right.
or YouTube videos, things like that. That's how we really start to spread that message. But we also have open access, and so that actually allows people, anyone, to just click and access your journal. Because a lot of these journal articles you can't access unless, one, you're a student, or B, you have a subscription to the journal, which is expensive, or three, you have to pay for like 48-hour access. And the
Yeah.
only way to get, yeah, it's ridiculous. The only way to actually get open access is, as a researcher, you have to pay a lot of extra money,
That
which
makes no
makes no
sense.
sense.
That's so dumb.
Yeah.
That's so
So,
dumb.
yeah, it's like we're finding all these things out, and we're like, great, got it published. Let's move on to the next one. But that's what we're essentially trying to do, right? Because this is a practical solution as well. We
Right.
found something interesting.
Yeah.
And so,
I mean,
um,
I think that your PhD. Sorry to cut you off, but I think like
no,
what your work is so incredibly important right now. It is one of the most one of the most important things at the moment, particularly for modern man with the prevalence of social media, because this is uncharted territory. Yeah, yeah, you're so great. You're so great. But this is really, for human beings, uncharted territory. We've always in the past relied on, because news had a different standard in the past. Now it's about, like I was saying on my video, it's like people are literally fighting for your attention. Not you, but everyone. Attention is money. So if somebody's paying attention like to this video, like to YouTube, I get paid for it, the more people who watch. Everything is about attention. Everything is about captivating each other. And so information has become less and less important. Like in ancient Greece, I mean, philosophy and knowledge and truth was just, well, at least from what we read from the people of that time. Maybe it wasn't in the broader public, but these things were just really, really important. So the question of how to get this important kind of understanding of why we believe in things off the bat and we shouldn't, and why misinformation, disinformation is spreading. We like the studies that you were doing. We know now, like we can have good information why that is, but getting that to the everyday person, getting that to, or here's the other problem: how many people do you think actually care about this problem? I know that there are studies I've seen recently, and I hate to quote studies without actually quoting a study, but I'm sure you could help me out with this. But that suggests that most people agree that social media is a problem in terms of the spreading of bad information. Most people think that, I think it's something like 60% of people in the United States think that social media is directly to blame to conspiratorial thinking and just bad information. So if we know this, what to do about it is, of course, the question. I wonder what you think about now that your daughter is getting of age. She's going to daycare soon, but she's getting of age to go to preschool. Well, I guess she's only almost two. But going to going to preschool, and what do you think should be the information given to children at this age? So like, how do you think we should start prepping children these days for what they will face as a father and as an educator, for what they will face in social media? Because they have no idea now, and they're evolutionarily at a disadvantage, because all of us are. So do you think that that's the time where that kind of information should be given, like critical thinking and how to,
It's a good.
I'm just talking and seeing if a question's in there somewhere.
No. It's an incredible question. And I've thought about this too, because that essential question, right, of who do we believe, why do we believe them, and what factors go into that? It's you know, that's what fascinates me. And so, especially with social media, I saw something. I was preparing material for a class I'm teaching this summer, and I actually was looking up about social media use. And I think between the ages of 18 to 29, that age group has an average of roughly eight social media accounts.
Wow.
And so the propensity to access or encounter misinformation is got to be astronomical. Um, but as far as like to give, I've thought about this with my daughter, is that whole, because I'm sure she's going to go through that stage soon enough where she's why. Don't stop that. Why?
Never stop. Why? Yeah.
Except because the thing is that don't take things at face value. Don't stop that critical thinking. Of course, you won't be able to critically analyze everything. We have to use those heuristics, those shortcuts, right? I always give the example to my class sometimes. If you go on Amazon and you're trying to decide between two wallets, and they're roughly the same price, but the one has 5 stars, the other has 3. You're not gonna go and research each wallet. You're just gonna be like, I'll take the 5-star one. There's some things that you just don't need to critically evaluate, right? Some things it's fine to just use these shortcuts. That's why they exist, right?
Right.
But I think if you're a weirdo like me who doesn't have social media, I would just tell my daughter, don't have it. But fiance, nah, she deletes her Instagram for a day, and then she's like, I did good, and then the next day she gets it back.
No, that's a normal thing. It's like people will say, oh, I'm going on a social media cleanse, and they do it for like 2 days, and then they're just right back to where they started.
Oh yeah. But no, I think that is, be careful of the information you encounter. Before social media, it was just word of mouth. It was just Bob tells you, oh, did you know that this? And you're like, okay, Bob.
Yeah,
whatever.
it's Bob. Bob's always talking shit.
And then you go on AskJeeves.com. And then you're just like, okay. But yeah, no, I think it's really interesting.
But I guess what I was trying to ask is what kind of things will you tell your daughter other than don't do social media? Because obviously she's going to grow up. And this is kind of a question for just young education. My opinion is, or from my perspective, it feels like that we need to warn children about this new problem for human beings and talk about it in a way that isn't biased. You know, a lot of people will use
Yeah.
their bias to say, well, if you watch Fox News, there's a lot of bad information on there, or if you watch MSNBC and CNN, there's a lot of bad information on there. They're trying to trick you. Make sure you listen to this kind of stuff. There's got to be a way other than just telling them that there's bad information out there to actually kind of, what's the word, brand critical thinking into their head. So when they encounter bad information, they don't take it at face value. What do you think are some of the things we can do for children, like such as your daughter's age and even older, with preschool and kindergarten?
Yeah, I think it's a that's another $1 million question. But no, I think a couple things, right? You know, every kid's different, obviously, but I think one way is, first, of course, try to start those reasoning skills, earlier on. If they want to do something, why? If you're going to do something, why are you doing
Right.
this? Try to get them to explain and have justifications for things. But also, um, it, you know, we all grew up, teenage years, all that stuff. Telling somebody not to do something is going to make them typically do the opposite. Um,
Well, I guess it's
and
kind of like,
so,
I think of, you know, children don't have much of a problem brushing their teeth. Well, maybe they do, but there are certain things I think we tell children at an early age that they just kind of go along with. Like, especially if you grow up as a Christian or something, there it's just the truth until, even if you go out in college, you become an atheist, and then you start thinking again, and then you go back to Christianity. Something embedded in that sense is what I mean. Like, I feel like we should somehow embed critical thought as something they can't forget.
yeah,
Something that if
yeah,
they do forget, it's looked down upon.
I think so. Yeah, I think a good way is to, fiance hates this, but is to always play devil's advocate.
Yeah,
Always
right.
plays
It's
devil's
good.
advocate. And I think that's something that you instill all the time. Is instead of them always asking why as a parent, you ask them why.
Ooh, that's a
And
good point.
so,
Yeah.
or okay, well, what about the other side? Um, you know, things like that. And you start that as an early age of, well, you explain that to me, or, but really have that devil's advocate side of, okay, well, are you looking at this blindly or through your own group's lens, or, and that will emerge. Or why do you have this strong belief? What about the opposing side? And when you start to really integrate that, then you'll, maybe get out of that more biased mindset of, my group says this, my group's right, I look good.
So, do you think that it's the responsibility of parents rather than our education system to give critical thinking skills as a kind of like basically place the
Um,
importance on that?
well, the public education doesn't, they teach more content based,
Right.
learn this stuff, regurgitate it on the test, and then when you're in fourth grade, do the same thing. Fifth grade, same. They don't teach critical thinking. They don't teach you how to learn. They teach you what to
They
learn.
and,
So
and,
there's a
and when they
big
do
difference.
teach critical thinking, like the scientific method, they teach you in a way that you just memorize the right answers. Like, okay, first I
Mhm.
form a
Oh yeah,
hypothesis,
it's like,
then I add a question, then I form an experiment. Not
yep,
really
it's a
integrating
sedentary
that
process.
into everyday thinking. And I wonder that's kind of a failure, isn't it, of our education
Oh
system?
yeah, the American education system's interesting.
It's
I
no,
think
I'm
when you
gonna
get to
say it. I could say
college,
it publicly. It's a bunch of crap. Our American
yeah,
education, the
I
standard
think
of our education is unbelievable, unbelievably
when you get
abysmal.
to college, there's a lot more agency, both for the instructor and for the student. And I guess, of course, obviously, that's public versus private,
Right.
wherever you go to. But yeah, and of course, unfortunately, though, you just went through 12 years of being taught what to learn as opposed to how to learn. And so that's when you come to college. And like, if you're taught how to learn, so here's how you critically evaluate something, here's how you because a lot of people don't have, you know, the literacy skills to determine whether or not something online is true or false. And so
Yeah.
having those classes is a very important thing, or teaching things like that. It's one thing to teach somebody how to read, but it's another thing to teach somebody how to evaluate. Two completely different skill sets.
It's like
Um,
it's like the difference between
yeah,
giving somebody fish or giving them a
teaching
fishing
them how
pole.
to fish.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
that's an office
exactly.
reference, but that's an old
Yeah. No,
saying.
yeah. It's like teaching somebody all the fish that exist in the sea versus, yeah, teaching them how to
Well, it's like
fish.
if you want fish, you know, school just gives people fish. Like make sure you. But what we
Oh,
should do
I
is
see.
teach how give them a fishing pole so we can fish whenever we want at our own accord. And do it correctly because it works every time. And that's the benefit of logic, reason, science, and those kind of things. So I have a question, but please feel free to not answer it because it might be a little sensitive. But
You're
I'm
good.
curious in your opinion about this subject within academia itself. And what I mean by that, higher level education. From my point of view and from my own experience, is that the rise of misinformation and disinformation, a lot of these things that are actually shown to not be true are being taught in colleges in various ways. And I don't want to use specific examples because I don't want it to become this to be inflammatory in any way. But I'm curious in your opinion on how this has affected higher level education. Now I know that your bosses and everybody that you work with right now are in education right now, so feel free not to answer totally like if you need a anyway, but you know the question. Are you comfortable with answering that question? How it's affected higher level academia?
Kind of. Can you rephrase it? The question?
I worry that a lot of people who actually project misinformation end up being college professors, end up being bandwagoning, end up doing these basic fallacious thought processes and are praised for it because of their position. I find, without giving specific examples, but this has been a problem within academia where the groupthink mentality, if you're on one side of this type of thinking or the other, determines entirely if you're going to be accepted in academia or not. Now, I've been in academia. My sister's also in academia, and I know many people who complain about this problem, where there is a kind of, I would say, politically charged um, temperament in academia that has started to actually stifle conversation because they're worried about having certain conversations, or they just automatically think that any type of conversation like that is wrong. Now, this is I know a more touchy subject, and feel free not to answer, and you won't be looked down upon for it.
Yeah, no.
But what what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think to answer that question, kind of twofold. One is with in academia, there's a lot more agency in what you teach and how you teach, right? But professors are put in an interesting position, right? And one is that they're put in a position to mentor, to also mentor. Um, and in so doing, your whole thing is you also want to establish relationships with your students. And when it's, establishing relationships with students, you want to make sure that you foster an environment that provides you that opportunity to. Um, and so I think a lot of, um, I mean, all the universities that I've worked at, I've, I teach how I teach. And so I've gotten good evaluations from my students. And so I think the key part, though, is also where you teach at. Different universities have different standards, have different protocols, and things like that. But I think as far as like limiting speech in classrooms and things like that, if I think I'm headed towards the right question and everything. Um, Honestly, I think with that, it's just more geared towards um, with with a position of power. You do sometimes have to be more careful with the words that you say. You could say this in a workplace if you're a supervisor with a subordinate in that position of power. Sometimes you have to be careful with things that you say. Same things with a professor versus with students, um, like that. Um, as far as like the polarization and stuff, I haven't witnessed that in any university that I've been at, really. So I don't really have any personal experience with that. But as far as your question goes, I think with any position of power, whether that be minute or large, um, then that's where some people tend to be more reserved with their word choice.
Well, yeah. I guess my question is more so the growing temperament of conversations that can be had and can't be had. Like, I did say at the beginning of this, I'm not going to get political with this. So I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there because I think the next questions would be politically charged, and I would have to go into specific examples and why the question comes from where it does. And I'm sure the audience, whoever's watching, will know where that's coming from. But I'm not so open to projecting my any kind of politics right now. I haven't thought about it enough whether or not I want to talk politics so much anymore. But I mean, talk politics openly yet. But I do worry about misinformation and disinformation being taught as truth in academia. And there are many, many examples of this. And just general lack of critical thinking skills on the basis of my group versus your group. And it's unfortunately politically charged at the most. So let's see. And do you not, so I guess to rephrase the question, do you not see an overall, or do you see an overall issue concerning what I'm bringing up, where the
Yeah,
bandwagoning
I
fallacy
think
has kind of run?
no, yeah. I think, and you can also rephrase this in the same way within a workplace, right? Um, like think about it in a workplace setting. In order to get a promotion, sometimes you just have to, you know, say things or do things, right? Say in academia, tenure is sometimes hard to get, and so you just kind of don't want to piss anybody off. And it's
Right.
not pissing anybody off per se. It's tenure is pretty straightforward, right? You have to typically get. It depends on where you're at. If you're at a liberal arts university, you're more likely going to do more teaching, less research. If you're at a research university, it's vice versa. And so the main thing, though, is that at the end of the day, you just want to teach, get good evaluations, and you don't want to get bad evaluations or piss anybody off. I'm not really in a position yet to have to deal with that tenure, um, fortunately, right now. But
One day.
I can only speculate that that would be, like I said, it's like the same thing. If you're in an organization and you want to get a promotion, um, you know, you try to fit in and fit in with that organizational identity,
Yeah.
right? And identity is different at every single place. Um, just think about like a religious university versus a non-religious university. You're going to have to probably act a little bit differently at a religious university versus not a religious
Right.
university. And yeah, so you might be like, sometimes I use profanity when I teach. I tell my students, hey, by the way, if any of that bothers you, let me know. I'll cut it down. If I was at a private religious university, that probably wouldn't be cool. And so those are just examples as far as having to, manipulate one's speech, but as far as other things, as you know, what to teach and what not to teach, um, I'm sure that there are. I haven't experienced any instances like that, um, but I'm sure that there are instances, especially when you're talking about getting promoted or tenure track or things like that.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, we covered a lot, didn't we?
absolutely.
And I'm sure there's so much more to talk about in reference to all this. There's a lot more to worry about, because that's one of my main concerns, is this kind of large spread, and how do we get good information to people in general, because it's obvious that that's what's needed. So, well, do you have any other thoughts or anything that you want to? No.
Not that I know of, man. I just appreciate you having me on the show, my dude.
Yeah.
For real.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You'll
I enjoyed
13
it.
people will watch you, and like 13 subscribers.
I'm glad I can
Maybe
actually trust me.
they'll watch 1 minute of it, so don't worry
Hey,
about.
that's all right. Any chance that I can get to talk my nerdy stuff, I like
Yeah,
it. So,
yeah. And if you want, we can do this again. If I have your permission, we can do this again. I would love to have you on again.
absolutely, man.
Yeah. All right, bro. Well, I appreciate the conversation. It's almost an hour, so maybe we should close it up. But thank you for coming on. I'll see you. I'll see you soon.
Absolutely, man. See ya.
All right. Later.